stocks, bonds, ETFs, straight out of downtown Chicago. This is Zach's Market Edge.
Welcome to Zach's Market Edge, the podcast about investing in your life. I'm your host, Tracy Reinick, and this week I'm joined by Zach's senior strategist, Kevin Cook, to talk about one of the hottest areas right now in stocks, the semiconductors. We've talked about them in the past, but here we are again because it's been a while since we've actually dove in on what's happening with them. And I thought since there's so many new investors and people who don't really know what's going on with the semiconductors and what they even are, that we would do kind of a basic show on which ones should you buy. There's a lot of them. I'm always surprised during earnings season, oh, that's in the semiconductors. Oh, they are too. I never know, what does one do versus the other? Why should I buy, X over here and not Y over there? So I brought Kevin on board today because he knows far more about the semiconductors than I do. As I just said, I'm pretty clueless, but he is not. So Kevin, welcome.
All right. Thanks for having me. And this is such a great time you decided to do this because an earthquake just happened in semiconductors in the past 2 weeks. And it's just, I can't think of enough geological metaphors to describe it. Seismic shifts, tectonic plates moving as one stock blows up and another soars. And it's still happening even 2 weeks later.
Okay, so what does that mean? What was the big event? Why?
So Intel, the U.S. giant and lead innovator in all things semiconductors for the last 60 years, they reported about a little over 10 days ago, and the report was solid, but they had a confession to make. They had been first of all, understand Intel does everything in-house, so when you think of them as a lead innovator, it's, they don't have anything made overseas. They make everything themselves. So what they said was, that plan we told you about last year where we were going to have this advanced technology and go below 10 nanometers in the scale of transistors? We're about a year behind on that plan. And so immediately Intel stock dropped that Friday. So Friday a week ago, Intel dropped 16% that day, and its competitor, AMD, Advanced Micro Devices, rallied 16% because they are now the chosen ones, because they already do this, what's called 7 nanometer technology, and they have it built by Taiwan Semiconductor. So this means that this advanced technology where the transistors are getting smaller and the spaces between them are getting smaller, this is what, it's what makes your laptop even lighter, or your notebook, where you can cram billions, literally, of transistors onto a chip or a board. And AMD is there. So they're going to get all this new business from, and I just looked at the AMD presentations for the past couple of weeks, and you think of all the notebook and laptop manufacturers out there, and the data center builders, they're all using AMD stuff, and they're going to be using more of it.
Okay,
this is basically what's happening here. So that's Intel's pain is AMD's gain in the past couple of weeks, and AMD's up another 8% today on a big upgrade. I think you saw.
Yeah, so that was my next question. AMD is just soaring now. Is it too late to get in that one? Is it over?
You know what? After AMD, I was looking at AMD a couple of weeks ago, and I'm like, God, I'd really want to buy it here around 60, but there were still bearish analysts, and I didn't quite understand it. Well, things became crystal clear after Intel dropped this bomb. And it was you still had a chance to get in last week near 70. And I thought, gee, we should really take a shot here. And now it's, now it's above 85 because Jefferies came out and raised their price target this morning from 86 to 95.
Yeah.
Because they said that AMD their share gain in these markets will continue to accelerate. And in his bull case, the analyst thinks that AMD could go from capturing 30% share over Intel in the next 2 or 3 years, that could morph into potentially capturing 50% of market share in these markets, everything from laptops to data centers.
Okay. Where does Qualcomm fit in with those two guys you just mentioned?
So
I see them mentioned in the same breath with AMD and Intel.
Qualcomm is more specialty for handsets and mobile, and they just had great news too, because Huawei, that whole controversy with Huawei, where they're getting pushed out, and American companies aren't allowed to deal with Huawei, and Qualcomm just basically inked a deal to secure a lot of the coming 5G business. And so, if there was any worries about, Huawei competition for Qualcomm, those were just put to bed. And so that's why Qualcomm also last week, the stock jumped from, like $90 up to 110 now.
Okay, so if I'm interested in investing in the 5G future, Qualcomm would be one of the names for that.
Absolutely, yep.
Okay.
And maybe a Xilinx too.
Okay.
There's a lot of, and I want to mention a player that's sort of underneath here that doesn't get talked about a lot, and that's Taiwan Semiconductor.
Yeah.
They're what's called a foundry. So they're the fabrication for the chip designs. AMD got out of manufacturing their own chips, whereas Intel didn't. AMD's like, we're not going to have a foundry anymore. We're going to ship it all to Taiwan Semiconductor. And Taiwan Semiconductor makes Apple's chips. Apple makes their own chips now. And they send the designs there, and Taiwan Semi is the fab for it. Taiwan Semi also makes NVIDIA's chips. And so another thing I did, I've done several pieces of content in the past 2 weeks on these topics. And the first thing I did was I had to give a shout out to our colleague Dan LeBeau, who has been pounding the table on Taiwan Semiconductor all year. Yeah. And even through the Corona crisis, he's like, this is the foundry that's winning all this business. When you have Apple, AMD, and NVIDIA as customers, you must be doing something right. And now they're going to Intel is going to have to give them their business too. And so he was pounding the table on TSM at $50, and it's just soared. So okay, that's sort of the nuts and bolts, infrastructure play on all this stuff too.
Okay. And now that you mentioned NVIDIA, where do they come in? They're on the graphics side, right? So if I'm video games, that kind of stuff is NVIDIA's specialty? Yeah, so when you use the word graphics when you talk about NVIDIA, the sort of the evolution of this company is that, yes, they were building chips for gaming. And these chips were called GPUs, graphical processing units. But what they figured out along the way is that these GPU chips could also had other big applications like machine learning, okay, which is a an intermediate form of artificial intelligence, and that these were you could create what are called massively parallel architectures to do machine learning or run tons of data in data centers. But AMD also makes their own GPU chips for gaming and for data centers. So AMD has become the competitor now, not just to Intel, but also to NVIDIA. That, I mean, clearly the analysts were not on top of this. If you look at what the analysts are piling over the top of each other in the past 2 weeks to upgrade AMD because they missed how excellent AMD was becoming. And the CEO there, Lisa Su, I mean, she's like the Jensen Huang, of NVIDIA that you didn't know about. And yeah. She's been making some smart strategic moves. And I did a video. I'm trying to find it right now. It's probably on Yahoo. I called it "Release the Ryzen," which is Ryzen is one of their chips instead of "Release the Croc," and a little play on that. And I went through
a couple of their investor and corporate presentations. One had like 70 slides in it, another had 30 slides in it. And just looking at the technology innovation going on at AMD, it rivals what NVIDIA has been doing. So that's why, people are piling into AMD, even though some say it's overvalued. Well, hello, so is NVIDIA. So they're looking at
NVIDIA's at 55 times. So it's not cheap either. What about Micron? That used to be the hot semiconductor stock for the prior couple of years, or at least for traders it was. But where does that fit in?
It always seems so attractive because of the valuation, right? It's trading, 3 times sales, and but because it's memory, DRAM and NAND, it's considered still such a commodity play tied to the semiconductor cycle. So they did sort of have a wipeout in earnings. They reached peak earnings and by early 2019 of about $6 EPS, and then that got slashed, by 70% coming into late 2019 and early 2020, and so they had their cyclical downturn, whereas the rest of semis didn't because they're so specialized. Now, here's where I got this one wrong, because I thought that Micron would become immune to the semi cycle because they weren't just memory for PCs. They weren't just tied to the desktop. They were doing stuff in mobile and data centers and even autonomous driving. So I thought they could be sort of the value stock play. While you pay 50 times for NVIDIA, maybe you could pay a little more for Micron, and that's still never the case. The stock just hangs out here at $50. But I own it, and I just consider it, as long as everything else is cranking along, and we're in the middle of the 5G, or we're not even in the middle of the 5G rollout. We're sort of still in the early stages of the 5G rollout. That Micron will. Their cycle troughed, and they will continue to see earnings and top line accelerate.
Okay. I hear a lot of people mention Lam Research and Applied Materials as well. Are those in fabrication? Are they competitors to Taiwan Semi? Is that where they fit in?
No, they're actually building the equipment for Taiwan Semi.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they're the picks and shovels. So it's called WFE, wafer fabrication equipment, and so Taiwan Semi is a customer, as would be Samsung, because Samsung is still sort of a player here, competing with Intel and also doing their own fab. So because they make all their own chips, and Korea doesn't want to outsource their chip manufacturer to Taiwan. So, that's why Lam Research and AMAT are, pushing their all-time highs. I think Lam Research just reported and off to another new high, because the equipment orders are there, and the build out for 5G just keeps rolling here.
Yeah. Okay. So these are all kind of interconnected.
Yes. Yeah, they're all. I mean, it's like a jungle or an ecosystem, so to speak.
Yeah, yeah.
And you kind of have to know what you're buying. And boy, I was a big bull on like Lam Research, for a few years, and then I basically, like a lot of investors, got tricked out of everything during the Corona crash, because you thought, okay, here comes. We've never had an economic collapse like this, where everybody stays home, we're shutting down all these businesses, and 30% hit to GDP. You just saw that technology didn't care, because the 5G rollout and software were just immune to any of that. And it really shows the strength of a global economy. People don't like the word globalism, and they want things made at home, but there is strength in having a global system, that can move production around the globe and serve different demand markets that may not be as hard hit by something like a pandemic.
Right. Where does Broadcom fit in this system? What do they?
So Broadcom is kind of, God, I mean, they're like a big blue chip. If I had to compare them to another industry, they're sort of the Johnson and Johnson of semis because they're so big and so diverse. So they have, let's say they have $15 of content in the latest iPhone, and that's just a rough estimate. It's been less. It could be more because they make these special chips that mobile phones need to communicate to find the nearest tower and to communicate clearly, and the signal is strong. These different booster chips. So I want to call it AVGO because it used to be AVGO, but they bought Broadcom and they kept the symbol AVGO. So not only are they there in mobile handsets, but they're building infrastructure for data centers too. So they're not building the picks and shovels like Lam Research, but they're helping with all the equipment you would need to build a data center.
Okay. What about Texas Instruments? They always kind of get the shaft every earnings season. I was like, Texas Instruments after the bell, and it's just not as crazy of a stock or that kind of.
Yeah, it's. I think it's because their sales and profit trajectory is so steady. They have these steady sources of demand and business that just kind of keep them sort of a steady grower. They're like another blue chip in semis, and obviously I don't know the particulars of their foundry and who they use or if they do everything in-house. So I'm not, I want to make sure I'm not a complete expert here on semis because I can't keep track of all these companies.
Yeah.
But longer term, it looks like Texan as they call it, has been one to own, just for sort of a blue chip, low volatility play.
Okay. All right. So back to kind of the original question. If I was a new investor in the semiconductor stocks, which one should I buy out of all these?
It's tough right here because I can't recommend NVIDIA way up here for new buyers. I bought it. That's the one thing I did right with semis was that I bought NVIDIA during the Corona crash.
Okay.
We're up over 100% there.
Wow.
And I told my people that I wanted to add to NVIDIA on any sort of pullback, at around 380 in NVIDIA. And it's just, once it got above 400, it chopped around 400, 420 for a couple weeks, and now it's up to 440. So there was you didn't even get a chance, to add on a dip there. AMD, I might consider AMD. Let me see where it's actually trading this morning. 84. Okay, so I think the way you play AMD now is, you have to be a buyer, set inside of 75.80.
Okay.
Just because their innovation cycle is, has just taken off.
Yeah.
In the past year, and they are going to capture more share from Intel in notebooks and laptops and PCs, and who knows, they might even steal a little business from NVIDIA once more manufacturers understand the quality of the designs. They have their own whole ecosystem of chips and speeds and sizes. Speaking of sizes, if a nanometer is 1/1000th of a meter, and so when we're talking about this, how did Intel bomb? Well, because they said they were going to build 7 nanometer technology, and they're not there yet. And everybody else is going to 7 nanometer and having Taiwan Semiconductor build it for them. Yeah. For reference of what a nanometer is, the coronavirus is bigger than 50 nanometers. And so we're talking about building transistors on a scale that is, less than 1/5 the size of the coronavirus.
Wow.
That microscopic scale. But 7 nanometer is going to become the standard because both AMD and NVIDIA are working on 5 nanometer technology. Okay. They're getting even smaller. Moore's law was the idea that Gordon Moore from Intel in 1965 said, based on what was happening with semiconductors, that they could, they could double in efficiency and shrink by half every 2 years. Yeah. And basically that was true for a long time, but then it started that growth trajectory started to flatten out, and we weren't getting as much, shrinkage of the transistors. But now it's back on, and NVIDIA says that what they do with parallel processing chips is even accelerating Moore's law, and that they're just going to be able to keep getting smaller with the size they can manufacture these transistors at.
Okay. Now this whole area is, super interesting and exciting, obviously, if you want to be on, where technology is going, obviously. So what about buying one of the ETFs here and just getting like a whole big group of them?
Yeah, I mean, that's been the play. I think, our ETF investor here, Nina Mishra, I think she grabbed the SOXX, which is the iShares Philadelphia Semiconductor Index,
right.
ETF. So
that's the biggest one.
Yeah. So the SOXX index you can't invest in because that's just an index put together by a Philadelphia exchange. But SOXX is the ETF on it, and hitting all-time highs. Here it is. As AMD soars, it's up to $298.
Yeah, and I looked up the holdings on that, and Qualcomm is its biggest holding at 8.5%, and then Broadcom is at 8%, NVIDIA is 7.9%, and then Texas Instruments also 7.9%. So basically, you're getting 8% of those big four, big guys.
Yeah, and obviously the lesson here for investors, when you get a big correction like we had, sometimes ETFs, if you can't pick a stock, like I don't know who's going to survive here, sometimes buying the ETF, you could have picked up the SOXX ETF for under $200 and made 50% on your money just this spring and summer. Wow. And another good thing about just keeping track of something like this is exactly what you did, Tracy, where you went and looked up the holdings.
Yeah.
So you're looking at, okay, who are the big players I need to pay attention to, and do I want to learn about these individual businesses or companies, or just buy the basket? And and it's like, here's the thing: if you're investing for your kids, and your time horizon is 10 years, buy technology ETFs. You could buy XLK and own, a piece of all technology,
right?
Or you could specialize in semiconductors with this ETF.
Yeah. Now, I did look at a couple other ETFs. The second largest one is the VanEck Vector Semiconductor ETF. That one is...
is that SMH?
Yeah, that's SMH. And Taiwan Semiconductor is the biggest holding in that one, and it's 11%. And then Intel's at 9%. You have NVIDIA again at 8.4%. And then a few of the others we mentioned, like Broadcom is in there. But if you want Taiwan Semiconductor, big exposure to that one, SMH sounds like it's the one for you. And then also looked up some of the niche ones. I looked up the Defiance Next Gen Connectivity ETF, and it's FIVG, 5G.
Okay.
It only has $351 million in assets, but that's not so bad for one of these small niche ETFs. And those, you're going to get a little bit different of the mix. Obviously, Qualcomm, which we mentioned as being one of the 5G players, is the biggest holding in that one at 5.3%. And then you have NXP Semi at 5.2%. Analog Devices is at 5%. Ericsson is at 4.5%. And then your Xilinx that you mentioned is in there at 3.7%. So
and that's FIVG?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. So this is relatively new. I I might have glanced at the holdings last year, but didn't really pay attention.
Yeah.
So this one's pretty exciting too.
Yeah.
And, I would say for somebody just getting into semiconductors and learning about it, this might be a good way to get some exposure. And then, and it also forces you to pay attention. Then you start learning about these companies. Well, why is this called a 5G company versus, another one that's not in here?
Right.
Can I mention another one? And I'll preface this by saying I just bought this company yesterday for one of my portfolios here. And I think it's an interesting play because they don't actually make chips. What they do is they make all sorts of testing equipment and software that the chip manufacturers need to figure out, does this work, the way we said it's going to work? And that company is called Keysight. And it was actually a spinoff from Agilent about 5 years ago.
Oh.
And I wrote up something last night for my followers after we bought the stock. I was just looking at their news releases. In just the past 3 months, they put out about 30 press releases, and half of them are about 5G solutions. Okay. Because of what they're doing with their testing and design equipment. So they also help design what these technologies need to do, and it gets in. It's everything from think of the antennas that are needed for wireless communication at these what's going to be 100 times greater speeds than 4G in some cases. Another cool thing that is they just let's see, was it yesterday? No, it was on the 30th. They partnered with a bunch of European autonomous driving companies. So IPG Automotive and Nordis, they collaborated with them because they're sort of the behind-the-scenes infrastructure for ADAS, which is Advanced Driver Assistance Systems. So even if we're not talking about, your car can drive itself, we're slowly going to be building in these ADAS systems that enhance or aid the driver with advanced technologies. Okay.
I've heard of Keysight before because they've come up in my value screen over the last couple of months. And I've had them on the Value Investor podcast because I always jump on anything that's tech related on the value side because you don't find much. So they are trading at like 23 times right now, but a couple months ago they were not that expensive. So they were a little bit more on the value side, even on a PE level. But compared to these others, 23 is pretty cheap.
Yeah, and the top line isn't growing gangbusters. This is a company that's going to grow 5% a year on the top line. And the other thing is, I tend to look at most technology in terms. My valuation metric is price to sales. What's the enterprise value versus their revenues. So you get, in software, everybody's paying over 20 times sales for some of these companies. Yeah. But you're starting to see in semiconductors, things are getting back up over 10 times sales.
Yeah.
And Keysight is only 4 times sales. So that's why I like it. It's sort of it's sort of the Micron value play.
Yeah.
Of the space, of the 5G space.
Oh. Okay, so we've covered a lot in this episode, and I do have a clearer picture of who does what and how the industry is kind of structured. So this was helpful to me. I hope it's helping some other people who, might be new to the semiconductors as well. I'm going to recap all the tickers because we didn't really mention much of the tickers when we were just kind of spouting forth the names. So it's going to be somewhat of a long list. So get ready, everybody who's listening. So we talked about Intel, INTC, then AMD, which is just AMD, then Qualcomm, which is QCOM. We mentioned Xilinx, XLNX. Taiwan Semiconductor is TSM. NVIDIA, NVDA, as an N is in Nancy, VDA. Micron is MU. Lam Research is LRCX. Applied Materials, AMAT. Broadcom does have the weird ticker, which was the old AVGO ticker, AVGO. Texas Instruments, TXN. And then a few of the ETFs. We had the SOXX Semiconductors, which is SOXX, two X's at the end there. Then we had the Van Eck Semiconductor, SMH. We had the 5G little niche ETF, which is FIVG as in Victor G. And then we had Keysight Technologies, KEYS. So somewhere in there, you're going to find some plays, or at least buying those ETFs, but this is definitely an interesting area, and we'll be covering it some more going into the future, of course. And I used to do those episodes like, is there any value? Are they value or value traps on the semiconductors? But most aren't value anymore. I can't do it. I'm like stuck not doing it. But I'll try to cover as much as I can on all of my shows, the Market Edge and the Value Investor Podcast. So don't miss a single episode. Be sure to subscribe. We're on Apple Podcasts and on Spotify. Make sure you get us on Spotify, but get us somewhere. And I'll see you again next week with some more stocks.
This material is being provided for informational purposes only, and nothing herein constitutes investment, legal, accounting, or tax advice, or a recommendation to buy, sell, or hold a security. Do not act or rely upon the information and advice given in this podcast without seeking the services of competent and professional legal, tax, or accounting counsel. Publication and distribution of this podcast is not intended to create, and the information contained herein does not constitute an attorney-client relationship. No recommendation or advice is being given as to whether any investment or strategy is suitable for a particular investor. It should not be assumed that any investments in securities, companies, sectors, or markets identified and described were or will be profitable. All information is current as of the date herein and is subject to change without notice. Any views or opinions expressed may not reflect those of Zacks Investment Research as a whole.